You open a dating app, swipe for 10 minutes, maybe you get one match. You start a conversation, it dies in 2 messages. You try again, same result. And after a while, it starts to feel personal, like you're doing something wrong, like you're not enough, like somehow everyone else figured it out except you. But here's the part nobody tells you. You're not experiencing failure. You're experiencing a system that was never designed to be equal. And once you understand how that system actually works, everything you've been experiencing starts to make perfect sense. At first, it just feels like a bad streak. Daniel doesn't think much of it. Maybe it's just the algorithm. Maybe it's his pictures. Maybe he just needs better openers. So he tweaks things. New photos, better lighting, a more confident bio. He even looks up what works, what gets responses, what women supposedly want to hear. And for a moment, it feels like progress. A few more matches, a couple of replies, but then the same pattern returns. Short conversations, delayed responses, interest that fades almost instantly. And the strange part is, it doesn't feel random. It feels consistent, like there's an invisible ceiling he keeps hitting no matter what he changes. So he starts paying attention, not just to his own experience, but to what other men are going through. Friends, forums, comments under videos. Different men, different cities, different backgrounds, same story. Low match rates, conversations that go nowhere, a constant sense of competing for attention. And that's when the question starts to shift. It's no longer, what am I doing wrong? It becomes, why does this feel the same for so many people? And if you've ever had that exact thought, write pattern in the comments. Not to agree with me, but to see how many other people are noticing the same thing. Because when a problem repeats itself across thousands of individuals, it stops being personal and starts looking like a pattern. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because on the other side of the screen, the experience doesn't look the same at all. On the other side, the dynamic feels completely different. Not necessarily better in every way, but undeniably different. Where Daniel sees silence, someone else sees options. Where he waits for a reply, someone else is deciding which message to answer first. And that contrast is where the confusion really begins. Because from Daniel's perspective, it looks like disinterest, lack of effort, lack of respect, lack of basic engagement. But when you zoom out, it starts to look less like rejection and more like saturation. Too many messages, too many matches, too many conversations happening at the same time. And when that happens, something subtle begins to shift. Attention becomes fragmented. Responses become shorter. Investment becomes selective. And most interactions never fully develop. Not because they couldn't, but because they don't have to. And this is the part that most men feel but struggle to articulate. It's not just that they're being ignored. It's that they're being compared constantly against other profiles, other conversations, other options that are just one swipe away. And in that environment, effort starts to lose its power. Because effort only matters when attention is scarce. But when attention is everywhere, it becomes cheap, replaceable, and easy to discard. So Daniel tries harder, better messages, more humor, more thought, more strategy. But the harder he tries, the more invisible he seems to become. And that creates a psychological loop that's almost impossible to escape.
because every failed interaction feels like feedback, like proof that he needs to improve, adjust, optimize, compete harder. Without realizing, he's adapting to a game where the rules were never equal to begin with. And this is where the situation quietly shifts from frustrating to something much deeper. Because what looks like a series of small, disconnected experiences is actually being shaped by something much bigger, something structural, something built into the environment itself. And once you start to see that, you begin to understand that this isn't just about dating anymore. It's about how attention is distributed and who gets to control it. To understand what's really happening, you have to stop looking at dating apps as dating and start looking at them as systems. Because that's what they are. Structured environments where attention is distributed, filtered, and amplified, not equally, but algorithmically. And once you see that, everything starts to click. Because in this system, attention isn't random, it's concentrated. A small percentage of profiles receive a disproportionate amount of visibility, more likes, more matches, more incoming messages, while the majority exists in relative obscurity, not invisible, but competing for very limited exposure. And that creates something that looks a lot like an economic imbalance,
where attention becomes currency. And just like any market, it follows supply and demand. On one side, you have a large supply of men competing for visibility. On the other, a more selective distribution of attention. And when those two forces collide, you don't get equal interaction. You get asymmetry. Some people operate in abundance, endless options, constant validation, multiple conversations happening at once. Others operate in scarcity, few matches, limited responses, long periods of silence between interactions. And here's where the real shift happens, because abundance doesn't just change outcomes, it changes behavior. When options are limited, you invest more, you pay attention, you follow up, you try to build something, because each interaction matters. But when options are everywhere, the incentive flips. You don't need to invest deeply because there's always another option waiting, another match, another conversation, another possibility. So interactions become lighter, more disposable, more interchangeable, not out of malice, but out of structure. And this is the part that most people misunderstand. They think they're observing individual behavior, but they're actually observing system-driven responses, because the environment is shaping how people act without them even realizing it. And once that happens, effort and outcome start to disconnect. You can do everything right and still get minimal results, not because you lack value, but because value is no longer being distributed evenly inside the system. And that's the moment where the illusion breaks, because what felt like a personal failure reveals itself as a structural condition. And once you see that, you can't go back to seeing it the old way. And this leads to a realization that's both simple and deeply uncomfortable. Dating apps didn't change women, they changed power. Because when you change who has access to options, you change how everyone behaves. Not just one side, everyone. But not in the same way. Because here's the rule that quietly governs everything inside this system. The side with more options has less incentive to invest, and the side with fewer options has no choice but to try harder. And once you see that, everything starts to realign. The short replies, the fading conversations, the lack of follow-through. It's not random, it's not chaotic, it's consistent with a system where one side is navigating abundance and the other is navigating scarcity.
And here's where most men get it wrong. They assume the solution is to increase effort. Better photos, better messages, better timing, better strategy. But effort doesn't solve asymmetry, because effort operates inside the system. It doesn't change it. So what happens instead is adaptation. Men adjust, they optimize, they overthink, they analyze every interaction like it's feedback, trying to decode what works, trying to earn attention, trying to compete in an environment where attention is already unevenly distributed. And the more they adapt, the more they reinforce the dynamic, because the system doesn't reward effort equally. It rewards position, visibility, perceived desirability, access to options. And that creates a silent divide, not between good and bad people, but between those who experience abundance and those who don't. And once that divide exists, it starts shaping expectations, what feels normal, what feels acceptable, what feels like enough. Because if you're constantly surrounded by options, your baseline shifts, and if you're constantly competing for attention, yours shifts too, in opposite directions. And that's how two people can be inside the same app, but living completely different realities, interacting in the same space, but playing by entirely different rules. And neither of them fully sees the system they're inside. They only see each other and misinterpret everything that happens in between. And this is where the cost starts to show, not on the surface, but internally. Because when you experience the same pattern over and over again, your brain doesn't interpret it as system dynamics, it interprets it as personal feedback. Daniel doesn't think, this is an asymmetrical environment. He thinks, I'm not getting results. And over time, that turns into something heavier. I'm not interesting enough. I'm not attractive enough. I'm not enough. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, through repetition. A match that goes nowhere, a message that gets ignored, a conversation that fades without explanation. Each one feels small on its own, but stacked together, they start forming a narrative. And the most dangerous part is, it feels real, because it's based on real experiences, real outcomes, real interactions, but interpreted through the wrong lens. So Daniel adjusts again. He becomes more strategic, less expressive, more calculated. He says what works instead of what he actually thinks. He filters himself, tries to be more appealing, less risky, more optimized. And without noticing, he starts disconnecting from himself. Because he's no longer interacting, he's performing, trying to match an environment that rewards attention, not authenticity. And that creates a different kind of exhaustion, not physical, psychological. Because no matter how much effort he puts in, the results remain unstable, unpredictable, inconsistent. And eventually, something shifts, not in the app, in him. He stops expecting much, stops investing deeply, stops taking conversations seriously. Not because he wants to, but because it feels safer that way, less disappointing. And that's the hidden consequence of the system. It doesn't just change outcomes, it changes people. It reshapes how they communicate, how they invest, how they see themselves, until at some point, they're no longer reacting to a single interaction. They're reacting to a pattern they've internalized. And once that happens, even when a real opportunity appears, it's filtered through skepticism, doubt, emotional distance, because experience has taught them not to expect much. And that's how a system that was designed to create more connection quietly produces the opposite: less trust, less openness, less genuine interaction. Not because people don't want it, but because the environment trained them to expect something else. So the question isn't, how do you win this game? Because that assumes the game is neutral, and it's not. The real question is, what kind of system are you operating inside? Because once you understand that, you stop mislabeling your experiences. Rejection doesn't always mean lack of value. Silence doesn't always mean lack of interest. And inconsistency doesn't always mean you did something wrong. Sometimes it just means you're interacting inside a structure where attention is uneven. And that shift matters because it changes where you place responsibility, not in a defensive way, but in a clear one. You stop overcorrecting, stop analyzing every message, every delay, every outcome as if it's a precise reflection of who you are, because it's not. It's a reflection of an environment where perception is constantly distorted by volume. Too many options, too much noise, too little investment per interaction. And in that kind of system, clarity becomes rare. So instead of asking, how do I compete harder? The better question becomes, what kind of system are you actually designed to reward? Because once you see that, you decide how much of yourself you want to invest in it, without confusion, without unnecessary self-doubt, without turning every outcome into a personal verdict. And that doesn't mean disengaging completely. It means seeing clearly, understanding that not every space is built for depth, not every interaction is meant to develop, and not every outcome is a signal about your worth. Because when you remove the illusion of fairness, you gain something much more useful: accurate perception. And with that, you stop chasing explanations that were never true to begin with, and start recognizing patterns for what they actually are. Not personal failures, but structural realities. At the beginning, it felt personal, like something wasn't clicking, like everyone else had figured something out that you hadn't. But now, you can see it differently. Not as a mystery, not as a failure, but as a pattern. A system where attention is uneven, where options reshape behavior, where effort doesn't always translate into outcome. And once you understand that, something shifts. Not in the app, in how you interpret what happens inside it. Because clarity removes confusion, and when confusion disappears, so does a lot of the unnecessary weight you've been carrying, the overthinking, the self-doubt, the constant need to adjust and optimize every small detail. You start to see that not every silence needs an explanation, not every conversation needs closure, and not every outcome needs to be internalized. Some things, just happen, are the result of the environment you're in. And the more clearly you see that, the less power those experiences have over you, because you're no longer trying to force meaning where there isn't any. You're recognizing structure, patterns, mechanisms, and that changes everything. Not because the system disappears, but because you're no longer blind inside it. And maybe that's the real shift. Not gaining more matches, not winning more attention, but finally understanding the rules of a game that was never explained to you. And once you understand the rules, you stop taking every loss personally and start seeing the bigger picture. If this gave you a different way to see what you've been experiencing, then this channel is for you. Subscribe, because we're not here to give you surface-level advice. We're here to break down the systems behind what you're living. And once you start seeing those systems, you don't go back to guessing.